In competitive Pokémon, pretty much all teams that people create fall into a certain archetype. Weather teams are perhaps the most obvious examples of this, but there's also more nuanced cases. For example, defensively oriented teams can be divided into many subtypes, from hard stall teams to more balanced teams focused on setting up and stacking hazards. Both team styles focus on slowly and indirectly breaking down the opposing team, but do it in different ways. Most of the popular team archetypes have been around for many generations, mostly because they perform consistently in each of them. However, one team archetype is especially known for its volatility, and it's an archetype especially popular with more casual players. This is the hyper-offense archetype. Hyper-offense is an archetype that is pretty similar to what you're probably envisioning. An aggressive style of team that aims to quickly overwhelm the opposing team, using only the hardest hitters and most threatening setup sweepers in any given tier. If one Pokémon can sweep through the entirety of the opposing team, that's fine. It'll still leave the opposing Pokémon damaged enough to give one of its teammates the opportunity to set up as well. And so on, until either you or your opponent have run out of usable Pokémon. This team style is particularly attractive for players aiming to quickly get a high rating on the ladder, as the fast-paced nature of this style can enable you to play a lot of games in a relatively short amount of time. However, most hyper-offense teams include at least one Pokémon that is doing something completely different than the rest of its team. The dedicated lead. A dedicated lead is also pretty similar to what it sounds like. I can't help it. Hyper-offense teams are very simple. A dedicated lead is a Pokémon specifically designed to be sent out first, which might sound like a self-imposed disadvantage. By essentially restricting yourself from choosing any other Pokémon to send out first, you lose the ability to anticipate on what your opponent may lead with. However, the purpose of a dedicated lead isn't really to stay alive for very long. A dedicated lead is, well, dedicated to setting up ideal conditions for its offensive teammates to win later, and most dedicated leads are pretty good at playing around bad matchups. So if a dedicated lead generally does not survive for very long, then what does it do for the short amount of time that it does spend on the field? A dedicated lead generally has two goals when it is sent out at the start of the battle. 1. Set up some kind of hazard, be it stealth rocks, spikes, sticky webs or toxic spikes, to help make sure that their teammates, once set up, can do as much damage as possible and secure knockouts that they otherwise may not have been able to achieve. Certain dedicated leads like Shuckle and Glimmora can even set up multiple hazards, which makes them more attractive for these offensive teams. 2. They need to provide their teammates with an opportunity to actually set up safely. Usually, this involves crippling the opponent's leading Pokémon in a number of ways. You can taunt them to stop them from setting up their own hazards, boosting their own stats first, or using status moves on your teammates. Alternatively, you can inflict the opposing side with status yourself to give your hard hitters more opportunities to set up, as a burn means physically attacking opponents will do less damage with their attacks, and paralyzed opponents may just allow you to set up for free entirely. And lastly, while this does not apply to every dedicated lead out there, some of the best ones also use a self-destructing move, like Explosion or Misty Explosion. Such moves are used for two reasons. First, it prevents the opponents from getting rid of the hazards on their side, as moves like Rapid Spin and Defog fail when there is no target, such as when said target just blew itself up. Secondly, such moves usually leave the opposing Pokémon weakened enough that your offensive teammate can easily knock it out once set up, which puts more pressure on the opponent. So yeah, while most of these dedicated leads might seem unassuming in contrast to their hard-hitting teammates, they might be the most important Pokémon on hyper-offense teams, and they are absolutely one of the most important mons to get right when building a hyper-offense team. However, the roster of the most used dedicated leads has remained pretty static over the years. In contrast to the most prominent physical or special attackers, which get almost completely upheaved every time a new generation or even a new DLC comes out, there's been a pretty solid roster of good dedicated leads that have managed to still be useful as dedicated leads across multiple generations. Even Azelf, the first true dedicated lead from Generation 4, managed to make somewhat of a comeback in Generation 6, 2 whole generations filled with insane power creep later. So why is that? Well, it's due to what I've already mentioned before. It takes a lot to be an actual good dedicated lead, and because of this there are inherently less Pokémon that fit the bill. You see, while different teams fall into different archetypes, the 6 Pokémon on any competitive team also all fall into a certain archetype, and they're all doing their own thing. You've got the hazard setter and or remover, the tank or just a straight up wall, the wild card that can use either offensive, defensive or support sets, or the all-out attacker that can deal major damage to key defensive Pokémon on your opponent's team so that your setup sweeper can win you the game in the end. On a well-built competitive team, every Pokémon is doing something different and they all have their own unique purpose within your strategy. Sure, some overlap may exist between different members of the team. It's always a good idea to not solely rely on one Pokémon to set or remove hazards, for example. However, both of these Pokémon also bring their own unique strengths to the table, which makes it so you can carry out their tasks in front of a wider pool of Pokémon compared to if you only had one of them. You may have heard competitive players talk about the niche of a Pokémon sometimes, and this is basically what they mean by it. Similarly to the concept of a niche in real life, where a niche is defined as the factors influencing how a species lives its life and basically describes its place in the wider ecosystem, a niche in competitive Pokémon is much the same. Damn, maybe I've gotten a bit too real with this.
Sir, this is a competitive Pokémon video.
Anyway, what it basically comes down to is that a Pokémon's inherent traits determine its place in the metagame, and the traits of the Pokémon around it determine how well it can carry out its role based on the strength of its counters and competitors, just like in real life. For example, a Pokémon with a high physical attack stat and a decent speed stat will likely be used best as a wall breaker or setup sweeper because its inherent traits have set it up to take on that role more effectively than that of a support Pokémon, for example. At least most of the time. However, there are different levels of specificity when it comes to how well a Pokémon can fit a certain role. If you want a physical attacker on your team, well, there's like 100 right there. Sure, some of them are a bit worse off in terms of stats and moves, but there's generally still plenty that can do well with their toolkit. But if you're looking specifically for a strong physical attacker that can also set up and remove hazards in a pinch, and for good measure, you'd also want them to be able to knock out Raging Bolt in one shot because the rest of your team is kind of weak to it, well, now the competition has diminished tremendously. So, what is the point of this story? Well, dedicated leads do not experience much competition because they are specialists instead of generalists. The list of criteria that I pulled up is pretty specific, so whenever a new generation comes out, there's gonna be less new Pokémon that fit the criteria for a dedicated lead compared to more general categories like physical wall breaker or wall. This then means that dedicated leads themselves also experience less power creep because less Pokémon from newer generations are infringing on their niche in the metagame. On top of this, the different ways in which these Pokémon can carry out their niche contribute to a diverse selection of them. Dedicated leads need to be able to prevent the opponent from setting up hazards alongside themselves. However, they can accomplish this through multiple ways. Taunt is of course the most obvious example, but other moves like Magic Coat can get the job done as well. The same goes for the other criteria, which also helps to keep more dedicated leads viable as all of them go about their role in a different way, and their effectiveness on a team thus depends more on that player's strategy and the other Pokémon on said team, rather than being completely subject to their innate strengths and weaknesses. And while we're on this topic, dedicated leads are exceptional team players, and because of this they kind of rely on power creep to stay relevant. Remember what I mentioned at the beginning of the video? How hyper-offense teams that employ dedicated leads are stacked with some of the strongest offensive Pokémon around? Well, in this case dedicated leads just straight up benefit from power creep in other categories of Pokémon, as the all-out attackers and setup sweepers they support get stronger, almost exponentially so, with each passing generation. This offensive power creep also benefits the viability of dedicated leads, as more people opt to use hyper-offensive team archetypes to take advantage of a generation's strongest attackers, because these can likely overwhelm the defensive Pokémon from previous generations much easier. So, what is the conclusion of this video? Well, every member on a given competitive Pokémon team fills a specific role based on what its base stats, ability, typing and move pool are geared towards. The more specific a Pokémon's role is on the team, the more difficult it will be to replace that Pokémon with something else. Thus, not as much Pokémon will be able to fit in these specific roles, such as the dedicated lead, and the ones that do are likely not as susceptible to competition, as their versatility lets them carry out their role in unique ways. For example, Shuckle and Slurpuff both have access to sticky webs, which in theory means that one should strictly be able to outclass the other as a dedicated lead. However, their differing toolkits cause this to not be the case. Shuckle may be able to set up stealth rocks in addition to sticky webs, but Slurpuff's ability, in combination with its access to Misty Explosion, means that it can prevent the opponent from removing the webs and allow its teammates to come in safely much more reliably than Shuckle. Because they both have their strengths and weaknesses that, even though they may perform the same role, differentiates them enough from each other, both are still likely to be used on different forms of hyper-offensive teams. However, dedicated leads are still affected by power creep, just not the kind that's happening in their own ranks. They need the most powerful offensive Pokémon of the generation on their team to stand up to the likely equally fierce defensive power creep, and if the defensive power creep of a new generation is stronger than that of the offensive power creep, this hurts the viability of hyper-offense teams and dedicated leads as a whole.